Welcome, parents, academic achievers, Waco High staff, and guests to our annual Academic Achievers Dinner and Ceremony. On this evening, we are pleased to recognize our students and their academic achievements. At Waco High, we take pride in our ability to teach and develop exceptional students. Pride runs very deep at Waco High School. Tonight is a demonstration of our students' pride and ability to meet and exceed academically and excellence. These students have maintained a 96.5 cumulative GPA during their high school career. 96.5. I have a confession, students. When I was in high school, I was always trying to find out who you guys were in each class because I wanted to sit right next to you. At this time, would all of the students please stand, please? Let's give them a hand. Let's give them a hand. Give them a hand. Thank you. Thank you. You guys may be seated. Next, we'll have Ms. Saxenian, one of our assistant principals here at Waco High School. She will come and introduce our speaker for the evening. Thank you.
That's a little tall for me. It is with great honor and pride that I introduce tonight's speaker. She was a 2001 Waco High graduate who was involved in show choir, member of NHS, and an academic achiever for 3 years, and was ranked in the top 5% of her graduating class. After graduating from Waco High, she continued her education at the University of Texas in Austin and graduated in 2005 with a Bachelor of Art in Government. Please welcome Beth Olson-Drew to the podium at this time.
Okay, let me readjust again. Okay, there we go. Hi, I'm really excited to be here tonight. And congratulations to all of you on your GPA. I remember when I was in 8th grade and 9th grade, I could not wait to be an academic achiever because I wanted to take Mrs. Hoover, my music teacher from Hillcrest. And those of you who went to Hillcrest know exactly why that was the case. I want to talk to you guys tonight about leadership and community. I grew up in a family that emphasizes the importance of political and civic leadership. And I learned by example that my community is my responsibility. I carried a sense of responsibility into every aspect of my adult life and career in state policy and issue-based nonprofit work. My experience at Waco High also helped instill this value. We don't all look the same. We come from very different backgrounds, but we are one community. And in fact, when it's all said and done, our whole society is one big, ugly, messy society. And like it or not, you and I are the leaders that will need to make the society work. And as leaders, I encourage you to push yourself outside of your comfort zone to address injustice. Find the confidence to push others out of their comfort zones to address a problem. Use your experience and the work of others to learn how to be effective. Now, I will warn you, being a leader can sometimes feel as alienating, as uncomfortable as it can be rewarding and reassuring. Fortunately, people who came before us have paved the road to make our lives a little bit easier. Okay, who here knows who Barbara Jordan is? Okay, oh, good. So Barbara Jordan is the perfect example of perseverance, leadership, and strength, and the best part is she's from Texas. She ran for the House twice in the early 60s, the Texas House, and lost. And then she ran for the state Senate and won in 1966. And this made her not only the first African-American woman to be elected to the Texas State Senate, but the first woman to be elected to the Texas State Senate. So she was in there surrounded by a bunch of white men, which made her job a little bit more difficult. But she passed Texas's first minimum wage bill into law. She was the first African-American woman to serve in Congress after she was in the Texas State Senate from the Deep South. And she was very deliberate and patient enough, but not too patient, to win over these older white men that she worked with and to really become an unbelievably effective legislator. She was also instrumental in the passage of the civil rights legislation. And she said this, and I think that it is just one of the most beautiful quotes I've heard. If the society today allows wrongs to go unchallenged, the impression is created that those wrongs have the approval of the majority. So our job is to make sure that does not happen. Okay, now how many of you have heard of Malala Yousafzai? Yep, you'll have more context in just a second. So Malala is your age, and she is a Pakistani activist for girls' education. And when she was 11 years old, she started writing a blog anonymously about the life of girls and women under the Taliban rule. And because of this, the Taliban put a hit on her. And on October 9th, 2012, she was shot. She was shot in the head. And her long recovery captured the world, and she continues to advocate for girls and women, literally all over the world. In 2013, she was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people. And in 2014, at the age of 17, she became the youngest Nobel laureate in history. She was on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart a couple years ago. And he asked her how she reacted when she learned that the Taliban wanted her dead. This is beautiful. Sorry. I started thinking about that, and I used to think that the Talib would come and he would just kill me. But then I said, if he comes, what would you do, Malala? Then I would reply to myself, Malala, just take a shoe and throw it at him. But then I said, if you hit a Talib with your shoe, then there will be no difference between you and that Talib. You must not treat others with cruelty and that much harshly. You must fight others, but through peace and through dialogue and through education. Then I said, I will tell him how important education is, and that I even want education for your children as well. And I will tell him, that's what I want to tell me. Now do what you want. You can do this. You can lead, you can take action. You don't have to go defeat the Taliban. You don't have to be elected to Congress. By simply walking out into the hallway and intervening between a bully and the person that the bully is victim, or the victim of the bully, you are making a difference. Making your opinion known on an issue you feel strongly about is taking action. And the more you do it, the more comfortable you become. And then suddenly it's second nature. And then you can start to influence others. And frankly, it's kind of fun. It really is fun. The part about putting people out of their comfort zone to help make a difference, that's kind of exciting to do, because then you get to see your effect on them. So I have a 2-year-old daughter, and I hope that in 16 years, one of you is standing up here encouraging her to do the same thing. Thank you, and congratulations again.
At this time, we're going to call the academic achievers. We'll go by grade level. When we state the parent or family's name, please stand, as well as the educator guest. Would all the sophomores please stand? Please bring your card with you. Christian Pauline Allen. Her mother is Mrs. Darlena Smith, and she's also accompanied by Miss Danita Johnston, her aunt. Her educator is Mrs. Haley Dean, math and homeroom teacher at Lake Air Montessori. Lauren Christiana Arias. Parents are Mr. and Mrs. David Knight. Her educators, Mrs. Carol Compton, who is at UHS and is her former 8th grade English teacher. Isaac Davis Arterburn, son of Dr. and Mrs. Don Arterburn. His educator is Miss Christy Lujan, WHS choir teacher. Nicholas Lloyd Atkins, son of Mr. and Mrs. Pat Atkins. His educator is Miss Kim Arnold, Hillcrest PDS 3rd grade teacher. He was his 3rd grade teacher at Viking Hills. Fallon Louise Bain, daughter of Judge and Mrs. Virgil Bain. Her educator is Mrs. Christine Williams, her WHS AP World History teacher. Nicholas Alejandro Barrera, son of Miss Basie Barrera and Rogelia Barrera. His educator is Mrs. Megan Harvey, Lake Air Montessori counselor. Sarah Caitlin Brown, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ben Brown. Her educator is Miss Caroline Brown, a retired teacher, and her grandmother. Carrie Lamar Berkeley Jr., son of Dr. and Mrs. Carrie L. Berkeley Sr. His guest educators, Miss Pauline Walton, his aunt, and his mentor teacher at Cesar Chavez. Elizabeth Covarrubias, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Tino Covarrubias. Her educators, First Sergeant James Hart, the JROTC Sergeant at Waco High. Pearson Blythe Crow, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bennett Crow. Her guest educators, Mrs. Stephanie Isbell, WHS counselor. Grace Dennis, parent Maid Dennis. Her educator is Mrs. Mary Battles, Hillcrest PDS 1st grade teacher. Christopher Scott Dupuy, son of Mr. and Mrs. Carrie Dupuy. His guest educator is Mrs. Sue Miller, his 1st grade teacher at Mountain View Elementary. Kamani Omar Ford, son of Mr. and Mrs. Kenneth Ford. His guest educator is Miss Aralina Nixon from Tennyson Middle School. Ricky Gonzalez Galindo, accompanied by Joanna Caro and Mrs. Maria Galindo. His guest educator is Mr. Ryan Alber, WHS Geometry Pre-AP teacher. Elizabeth Garcia, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Camarino Garcia. Her guest educator is Mrs. Karen Kemp, a retired Provident Heights educator. Made Yetzo Guerrero, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Juan Guerrero. Guest educator, Ms. Amanda York, Tennyson Middle School Spanish teacher. Kaylee Savannah Huser, accompanied by Ms. Sherry Huser, Ms. Dixie Huser. Her guest educator is Mrs. Mary Duty, Tennyson Middle School 7th and 8th grade history teacher. Olivia Nicole Jackson, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Howard Jackson. Her guest educator is Coach Lynn McNeil, her WHS softball coach. Shalexia Lindsay Johnson, accompanied by Miss Alexandra Medina, her mother, and Mr. Tade Bowen, her stepfather. Her educator is Miss Linda Perez, her elementary homeroom teacher at EOAC Head Start. Brian Lopez, son of Mr. and Mrs. Juan Lopez. His guest educators, Mr. Joel Colosimo, the WHS art teacher. Charity Shamir Lyons, daughter of Cynthia Lyons and Frank Nunn. Her guest educators, Dr. Lindsay Jones, WHS AP chemistry teacher. Hallie Ashlyn Maddox, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Aaron Maddox. Guest educator, Mrs. Ginger Lovelace, her kindergarten teacher at Crestview Elementary. Samuel Luis Martinez Jr., accompanied by his sister, Libby Martinez. His guest educators, Mr. David Weigert, WHS orchestra teacher. Haley Grace Miller, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Trey Miller. Her guest educators, Dr. Cecilia Boswell, former WISD Advanced Academics Director. Valerie Nicole Sanchez, accompanied by her mother, Miss Mabel Sanchez, and her sister, Miss Teresa Sanchez. Her educators, Jenny Hawley, her dance teacher from Jenny Hawley Dance Studio. Nicholas Matthew Sanders, son of Mr. and Mrs. Milton Sanders. His guest educator is Mr. Matthew Myers, history teacher at Harmony. Hannah Diane Shriram, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Robbie Shriram. Her guest educator is Linda Pringle, a retired librarian at Crestview. Cassidy Lee Stieg, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jeff Stieg. Her guest educator is Mr. Stephen Petrie, WHS Atlas chemistry teacher. And last, David Villegas, son of Mr. and Mr. Gelasio Villegas, guest educator, Dr. Richard Sevchek, WHS pre-AP chemistry teacher. Let's give one more round of applause to all these wonderful sophomores. Okay, sophomores, you may take your seats, and juniors, would you please come forward? Oh, please bring your name cards. Ashley Taylor Allen, accompanied by her mother, Tracy Allen, and Brenda Mashburn. Her educator is James Stewart, former WHS former BIM teacher. Sandra Rocio Arias, accompanied by Maria and Patricia Arias. Educators, Miss Miriam Sawaya, WHS Spanish teacher. James Christian Barrientos, son of Mr. and Mrs. Felipe Barrientos. Guest educator, Mr. Paul Gonzalez, WHS AP English teacher. Nellie Ruth Buchanan, accompanied by Marcy Malugan and Linda Buchanan. Guest educator, Mr. Paul Gonzalez, WHS AP English teacher. Sylvia Stephanie Jacqueline Knatzer, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Kyle Knatzer. A guest educator, Mary Ann Keller, her former history teacher at Tennyson. Stephanie Flores, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jose Flores. Guest educator, Coach Casey Summy, her WHS cross-country coach. Haley Deshay Green, accompanied by Sheila Crawford and Daryl Green. Guest educator, Mr. Anthony Sarfo, WHS Pre-AP Algebra 2 teacher. Logan Paul Guardiola, son of Mr. and Mrs. Paul Guardiola. Guest educator, Coach Pat Gresham, WHS soccer coach. Betsy Carolyn Hahn, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jim Hahn. Guest educator, Miss Betty Murphy, her Bible teacher at church and also works at Region 12. Joanna Marlon Hernandez, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Juan Hernandez. Guest educator, Mrs. Stefani Arredondo, WHS U.S. history teacher. Bennett Bailey Johnson, son of Judge and Mrs. Matt Johnson. Guest educator, Mr. Matthew Bakovin, WHS German teacher. Zane Roy Cole McDurham, son of Mr. and Mrs. Doug McDurham. Guest educator, Mr. Corey Garrett, WHS theater teacher. Crystal Perez, daughter of Federico and Estela Perez. Guest educator, Mr. Ken Heller, WHS dual credit U.S. history teacher. Ramon Perez Jr., son of Maria Perez and Manuel Marino. Guest educator, Miss Alexia Manas, former teacher at Brazos Middle School. Kristen Lee Petrie, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Petrie. Guest educator, Mr. Delaney Vaughn, WHS pre-cal teacher. Adriana Quintero, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Quintero. Guest educator, Mrs. Jessica Bird, WHS athletic trainer. Melissa Isabel Rodriguez, daughter of Tatiana Lopez. Guest educator, Mr. James Yasko, WHS world history teacher. Bryson Glenn Shavers, son of Mr. and Mrs. Chuck Shavers. Guest educator, Miss Rebecca Kaylin Childress, WHS theater teacher. David Gavin Thompson, son of Miss Gabriela Gutierrez and Mr. David Thompson. Guest educator, Mr. Justin Alfetti, WHS pre-AP physics. And Rita Renee Zuniga, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joe Zuniga. Guest educator, Mrs. Leticia Hinosa, first grade teacher at Crestview Elementary. One more round of applause for those juniors. Juniors, you may take your seat. Seniors, please stand, bring your cards with you. Giovanni Betancourt, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jose Betancourt, educator, Mrs. Sandra Gibson, former Spanish teacher. Giovanni will be going to the University of Texas in Austin. Jonathan Deshawn Breeding, accompanied by mother Tanika Glenn and Sylvia Glenn, educator, Mrs. Nikki Burnham, WHS AP economics teacher. Jonathan will be attending the University of Houston. Tiffany Amber Brenner, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Brandon Brenner, Educator, Mrs. Lissa DeVoost, WHS AP US History teacher. Tiffany will be going to McLennan Community College. Megan Elise Edwards, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Dowdy. Educator, Mrs. Carrie Forehand, WHS choir teacher. Megan will be going to MCC. This boy has big dreams. Dr. Trevian Tyree Freeman. Son of Mr. and Mrs. Alfred Freeman. Guest educator, Mrs. Brenda Freeman, former South Waco teacher. Trevian will be attending the University of Texas in Austin. Sochi Garcia, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Luciano Garcia. Guest educator, Mr. Michael Jones, who's unable to attend, but he's WHS forensics teacher. Sochi will be going to Texas A&M. Abigail Diane Garner, daughter of Dr. and Mrs. Brian Garner. Guest educator, Mrs. Lissa DeVoost, WHS AP US History teacher. Abby will be attending Baylor University. Josefina Pescador Gonzalez, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jose Gonzalez. Guest educator, Mrs. Brenda Gomez, WHS AP Government teacher. Josefina will be attending MCC. Victoria Marie Labar, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Kenneth Labar. Guest educator, Mr. Rathanak Leung, WHS animation teacher. She will be attending TSTC. Garrett Austin Mulholland, son of Mr. and Mrs. Richard Mulholland. Guest educator, Mrs. Paige Connell, former English teacher at WHS. Garrett will be attending McLennan Community College. Antonio de Jesus Najera, son of Stephanie Jacquez and Romero Najera. Guest educator, Mr. Mark Penny, auto tech teacher at Waco High. Antonio will be attending Columbia University. Diana Olveda, daughter of Miss Florinda Luna. Guest educator, Mr. Floyd Smith, interior design teacher. Diana will be attending TSTC. Brittany Nicole Peoples, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Peoples. Guest educator, Miss Danita Rembert, her 5th grade teacher at J.H. Hines, now retired. Brittany will be attending Mary Hardin Baylor. Brenda Reynoso, daughter of Paula Reynoso and Maria Reynoso. Guest educator, Dr. Catherine Hopkins, WHS AP biology teacher. Brenda will be attending the University of Texas in Arlington. Daphne Seidner, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John Seidner. Guest educator, Mr. Delaney Vaughn, WHS AP stats teacher. Daphne will be attending McLennan Community College. Jennifer Tapia, daughter of Mr. Ruben Tapia. Guest educator, Mrs. Michelle Myers, WHS CNA teacher. Jennifer will be attending Texas A&M. Asia Danielle Vincent, daughter of Ms. Sheba Sanders, Ms. Marilyn Sanders. Guest educator, Mr. Joe Rizzo, Guama teacher. Asia will be attending TSTC. Janisha Rashay Walker, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. James Hall. Guest educator, Dr. Cecilia Boswell, former director of advanced academics. Janicia will be attending the University of Texas in Arlington. Micah Isaiah Ross Weaver, the son of Miss Veronica Weaver, guest educator Mr. Byron E. Swan, retired band teacher. Micah will be attending the University of Texas in Arlington. Jocelyn Marie White, daughter of Miss Maria Sanchez and Mr. Bobby White, guest educator Miss Amanda Chansey, Sewell Ross elementary teacher. Jocelyn will be attending the University of Texas in Arlington. Gerald Glenn Wilburn Jr., son of Mr. and Mrs. Gerald Wilburn Sr., educator Mr. Laryl Curtis, former AP at Carver. He will be attending McLennan Community College. One last round of applause for our seniors. All right, seniors, you may take your seat.
Is this Waco High pride or what? We have the best of the best at Waco High. Thank you, thank you, thank you to parents, grandparents, educators, colleagues, WISD School Board. This is what it's all about. And we really appreciate each and every one of you for being here tonight. And students, continue the tradition of Waco High. Thank you.